Good evening and a warm welcome to this very special episode of Spätschicht TV. I'm here with Professor Fedtke from the Chair of Common Law at the University of Passau. Just recently, Professor Fedtke managed to invite a few international experts on the subject of liability for carbon emissions. We had them sit down together with two students at our university and discuss liability questions as far as climate change is concerned. But before we move on with our talk, I'd like to ask you a few questions about this very special project. What made you arrange this meeting of international experts here in Passau?
3 reasons. Climate change is topical. The world is thinking, talking, demonstrating for action against climate change. And it's time we did something. Just recently, Focus, which is a German weekly, titled Was wir jetzt tun müssen, what we have to do now. And my answer to that, my spontaneous reaction was, well, we should have been doing so much 60 years ago, because knowledge of climate change, knowledge of the consequences of human activity on this planet is not new. It's been with us for decades. So it's time that we take action, and I think it's time that the law makes a contribution. And one of my fields of expertise, which is tort law, can, I think, make a meaningful contribution. That's the reason why I thought we should get together here in Passau. The second reason is that the University of Passau has considerable expertise in this area. There are several colleagues, several projects in the field. There's a big project on sustainable development and why humankind has difficulty dealing with the problems that are so obvious and utilizing the knowledge that is there to tackle these problems. So there's a large group of colleagues from various areas, various disciplines, thinking about climate change and the consequences of human inactivity currently. There's another project on traffic and how artificial intelligence can help us organize traffic in a more climate-friendly way. So I'm hoping that this project here, our own, can interact with these other initiatives fruitfully, so that there's some synergy effect between these various strands. And finally, the University of Passau is generous. In order to organize a meeting like that, you do need funding. And I'm happy to say that the University of Passau has in the past and on this occasion again provided the necessary funds for a meeting of this kind.
What project would you like to arrange together with these experts?
Our target is the judiciary, courts, judges. There are many agents of change in society. There are legislators, there's the economy that will react to incentives. There are grassroots movements, of course, and there are courts. Just recently, again, the Court of Appeals in London ruled that Heathrow Airport may not build a 3rd runway. And the reason is quite striking. It's climate change and the climate change obligations of the United Kingdom. We have had litigation in Germany. A farmer from Peru sued a German energy provider, RWE, because a glacier behind his property is melting and endangering his property. And he needs to take precautions, which is costly, relatively costly. And he's suing this German company here in Germany for climate change reasons. So judges, courts are confronted with these issues. And I think, especially in the common law world, judges are oracles of the law, are oracles of change, and can be very influential. So my hope is to provide a framework of cases, of thinking around tort law issues, so that judges, when they have to decide these cases, can kind of take a look, can read into the material, can hopefully be convinced of our approach that carbon emissions should attract liability. But there are many, many difficult questions of law. And imagine a court with limited time, limited expertise maybe, must be grateful to have that project and the results of that project easily accessible in order to tackle cases of this kind.
So this project is something to really be excited about?
Oh, absolutely. I'm completely excited. I grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and as far as I can think back, my political interest has been attached to questions of climate change, of an increase in the world's population and the consequences attached to these developments. And given the global impetus that young people, students at schools, at universities are giving to this is a moment of opportunity. The door is ajar and we need to open it fully and invest as much as energy and as much thinking as we can into these topics right now. So I'm very excited about this opportunity.
You just mentioned the student movement. Why is it important for you to include the young generation's voice in your project, and how are you going to assure that?
Well, two things. For one, we've been talking about consequences of increasing growth. The economies globally are growing, our living standards are growing. There are many more countries on this planet Earth that are striving to have the same living standards as we do in Europe, for example, and there are consequences attached. Now, 60 years ago, these consequences seemed remote. The report to the President of the United States, 1980, said there will be consequences in 2020, in 2030, in 2050. That seemed distant, that seemed generations down the line. It's upon us. So our current generation, my own son, 12 years old, the students at the University of Passau currently, will be the ones facing these consequences. It is here, it is now, and it is important to involve these generations as far as we can in our thinking about climate change. Climate change and our project, the reaction of law to climate change, will require a careful balancing of interests. And if we want to protect the environment, the question will be, what about jobs? If we want to address climate change, the question will be, what about our lifestyles? And I think it's imperative, if this is to work, and to be fair, to involve the current young generation in our thinking about the future of this planet.
Well, thank you very much for this quick interview and of course for organizing this extraordinary event here at our university. But let's have a look at our experts' point of view on the question of liability for carbon emissions.
Welcome to this Crossroads event. Today's theme could not be more topical. We'll talk about the liability for carbon emissions. So it's a global issue and truly existential for the human race. So really a crossroads for planet Earth. Passau is, I think, an interesting location for this discussion. If you look at Town Hall, you can see the markings of past floodings. The city was flooded many, many times. And it is actually an argument perhaps for the deniers of climate change, because they can point to the highest mark, which goes back to the 14th century, and they can say, well, it's been there for such a long period of time. This is not unusual. It comes and goes, and at the moment it's coming, but look, Passau is still there. On the other hand, I think Passau is a nice example for those calling for action, because the number of floods has increased over the past years. It seems to be with us more often. And in fact, the second highest mark historically was the flood the city experienced in 2013. So it really is an interesting location to have this discussion. Let me introduce you to our guests here in the studio. There's Brian Preston, who is Chief Justice at the Land and Environment Court in New South Wales. We have Jaap Spier. Professor Spier was Advocate General at the Hoge Raad in the Netherlands and is closely connected to the universities of Cambridge and Stellenbosch. There's Ulrich Magnus from the University of Hamburg, my alma mater, a close collaborator these past years, an expert on tort law, all issues of tort law, involved in many European projects concerning principles of tort law in Europe. There's Bernhard Koch from the University of Innsbruck in Austria, again involved in many European projects involving questions of tort law. There's Bastiaan Kok from the Netherlands, a close collaborator of Professor Spier, closely connected to the University of Leiden. And then there's Markus Kiermeier, our only non-lawyer in this round, if I may say. So a warm welcome to this different perspective here. Mr. Kiermeier is a master's student in the European Studies program here at the University of Passau. And finally, last not least, Jaroslav Kiselov, a law student here at the University of Passau, again, a fifth semester student and a very engaged student in my torts law class. So a warm welcome to you all. Let me start with a question to you, Justice Preston. We've seen in the past weeks incredible pictures from Australia where fires, bushfires, forest fires at an unprecedented scale, I believe, have devastated the country, have caused a tremendous impact on the environment and on human beings. My question, Justice Preston, is not legal at all. It's more sociological. Climate change seems to be remote, distant, something that we do not really, as human beings, as individuals, can feel, taste, or smell. Now, something is happening in Australia. My question is, does this bring climate change home to the people? Is it your sense that broader, larger parts of society are now realizing something has to change, it's knocking on our door?
Undoubtedly that's true. The fires, been going for so many months, the temperatures are so severe, the smoke haze just completely blocks out the sky or views. And what has really happened, it's literally seared in the minds and the lungs of the Australian people. And you're right, global climate change is always does seem remote. And that's one of the problems in driving action. People sort of say, well, I don't need to do it, or what can I do? It doesn't seem connected. And the severity and intensity and extent of the fires and the duration of how many months it's been going on has meant that this is now part of the lived experience of the people of Australia. And that is driving a change in their social consciousness. People in Australia actually have been quite environmentally conscious. It oscillates, but it's always been in the top 3 issues for voting. But other issues sometimes end up predominating. But in recent times, there has been a change in social consciousness. And you see in the media reports where irate citizens whose homes have been razed, whose animals have been lost, sometimes even their relatives have been lost, confronting the politicians who are denying that their climate change is real. And it makes for great footage, but you see that very real and personal hurt felt by these people, and confronting the politicians saying, how can you deny that climate change is real? What are you going to do about it? And I think that it's very unfortunate that we have to get to that degree of harm to people and planet before there is that sort of call for action. But there's something good that's come out of this, then that may be something that's is beneficial.
Tremendous pressure, if I recall these images that were transmitted to the world of the Prime Minister visiting a small village and having in 2 vehicles and his bodyguards having a serious issue trying to get him out of there safely because the people were really very, very angry.
Yeah. And it's very raw. I mean, that's the thing that really expresses it, and that's what makes it such compelling viewing, because we then relate to it, because it's that the rawness, the emotion coming through. There's nothing filtered, and so much of these days with politicians, it's all managed, and they weren't able to control that and manage it, and so you've got that degree of intimacy between the interaction. And that's what I think really related to people, and that's why it's going to be an endearing and much played set of footage because of that personal response that came from the people. It
clearly conveys a very urgent message currently. This is an academic project, of course. We're thinking about liability in tort for carbon emissions. Tell us something about the background of this project. You are the driving force behind it. Tell us something about, what it is that led you to invite us all, get us all together and discuss these liability issues.
Well, the climate change picture is changing for the worse. The fires in Australia, excessive droughts, torrential rain, and many other natural catastrophes which get worse and worse. Global emissions are still rising, and there is very little reason to believe that that is going to change soon. They should have decreased already significantly. The opposite is happening. On top of that, ever more alarming reports by the scientific community, IPCC and many others. You would expect that would bring people to their senses that a lot must be done and that we need real action. Well, perhaps they believe that we need real action, but that's not what happens. And that means that we will unfortunately face ever higher losses. There are already significant losses, and in the near future they will become really unmanageable. And that's the idea of this project. We should try to find a way to keep liability manageable. And that means, unfortunately, that we have to make choices. It's impossible to compensate all losses. So we have to think about questions, difficult questions. Which losses are or should be compensable and which losses are or should not be. That requires difficult, at times arbitrary choices. That's a matter of fact. And what we are trying to do is to paint a blueprint that provides solutions to the challenge liability law poses to all of us. And I'm sure, Bastiaan, that you want to add something.
Add something, yeah. With respect to this project, it's not about finding the best possible solution. As Jaap said, it won't be possible to make everyone happy with the choices we've made, but we're going to do our utmost best to find a balance and bridge the gap between intra and intergenerational equity.
I think we'll come back to this balancing of interests, which is a core question, I think. If we try to, approach this issue from the public law or from the private law side. But let me ask you, Ulrich, first. You have a lot of experience in a very different area of the law, which is the international sale of goods. And in the 80s, the international community interested in commerce decided in a fairly short period of time, and quite successfully so, to create and then implement a common instrument that can be applied across now 80 plus, 90 plus, I think, nations called the CISG, the UN Convention for the International Sale of Goods. And yet, such an international instrument causes friction, causes difficulties. But on balance, it's been quite successful. Now, here's my question. Global warming is a global phenomenon, and I think no single society can solve it by itself. Yeah. So we need to collaborate. What lessons, what experience do we have from other areas of the law that could perhaps help us chart a path into this very new and very immediate difficulty? So it's not about trade and something, that helps everyone there. It's more about a really serious risk for humankind. Is it possible to collaborate at that level?
I doubt very much
Come on.
that we can learn some lessons from the CISG. Indeed, that is a very successful convention, now 40 years old. But the preparation of that convention started already in the 20s of the last century. So it lasts a long time for preparing such a successful convention. And
we do not have that time, of course.
We do not have that time. And it's telling, I think, that the convention is on international trade, on facilitation of international trade. And many trading, or almost all trading nations of the world have ratified that convention, and the convention is now very effective. For tort law, for law of liability, involuntary liability, we have some conventions in the field of nuclear power liability, on sea pollution liability, but we have no global convention on liability as such. And why? It's not just in the interest of commerce and industry to have a convention on that field of law. There are no driving forces behind such an idea, and therefore I doubt that we will ever have such a convention, a global convention on liability. Although from the aspect of global warming, we actually seriously need such an instrument, a common approach. Climate change does not stop at the borders of countries. It's all over the globe, and we need a global instrument actually, and global organs to fill that gap.
But
so there's yes, please.
But why, Ulrich, is it not in the interest of the industry to forge an international convention?
Well, it is not in the industry to fix the level of liability.
Then others will fix it.
Others will fix it, and you see you perfectly know the experience with liability for climate change. Evidently, at present, almost nothing comes from that. And therefore, industry and commerce is quite content with that situation. They don't want to be made liable for events very far away in other countries, and therefore there are, I guess, strong lobby groups that would defend the idea of freedom of trade, freedom of activities all over the globe without limits by liability.
So perhaps there's more willingness to collaborate if there's a profit, and less willingness to collaborate if there's a loss to be shared, right?
Indeed.
Which is human, I guess, at some level, but won't help us tackle
that
this
brings
global
it
problem.
to the core.
At least they think that collaboration will limit their liability.
Yeah.
So it's not only to increase their profit, it's also to lessen their liability.
Yes.
Yes.
Then there is an incentive.
Yes, and I think that remark is quite on spot, because we've spent much of today over at the Juridicum talking about the limits of liability. So there's a good point there. Bernard, this is a new problem, I think. I mean, it's not as new because I just said, it goes back to the 1960s and perhaps even earlier. But let's put it this way, we live in extraordinary times. And my question to you is, tort law as a system which we're trying to use from the private law side to tackle what the public law side could try to regulate as well. Tort law is an old system going back to Roman times and beyond. My question to you is, do we need to adapt this tool, tort law, in order to make it capable, enable it to tackle an extraordinary problem, a problem of extraordinary dimensions? Or do we have the tools and we just kind of need to readjust them and think them through and solve the new problem that we really are facing? What say you?
Well, I don't think that the basic underlying idea of tort law should be changed. The basic idea is essentially that losses should be allocated in a fair, reasonable and equitable manner. And that should always be the guiding force behind everything. However, the law in the books, as you know, is a very simplified, standardized version of applying that principle to standardized situations. But if there is a new situation where new challenges are posed, where the balancing of interests that is in the common interest is difficult for various reasons of the particular circumstances, there is, of course, a need to adjust this and adapt it. But I would not say that the basic idea of balancing the interests and thereby finding a proper way to allocate the risk, that path should never be left.
Let me follow up with a very short question only. We've spent the day discussing various tort law concepts, and basically looking back, I think we've stayed within the logic of traditional tort law. At the same time, I think we agreed that we might have to, kind of widen or expand the toolbox and come up with a couple of fresh ideas or new ideas, maybe unorthodox ideas that need to be, discussed and where some measure of, God knows, convincing has to be done. Can you give us an example where you would say this is a new idea, this is perhaps something outside the box and could help us tackle climate change?
Well, some of the more common problems of applying the traditional concept of tort law is, for example, proving causation and finding the causal link between one particular activity and one specific loss. And of course, in a problem of such a global dimension, with so many players involved, connecting the dots is a huge challenge. You have multiple people affected, both individually and as a people. And you have multiple players, not just certain members of the industry, but there are many, many potential causes. And that problem is certainly on a scale that is unprecedented, I think, in traditional tort law theory, of course. However, there have been solutions to challenges of causation in the past, and these could at least provide a starting point, at least, for further analysis.
So, to paraphrase, we switch on the lights in Germany and the glaciers in Peru start melting. How do you kind of disentangle that connection? How do you make that? I think we'll come back to maybe some other areas of tort law that have been tackled in the past and that could provide some lessons for this particular problem in a minute. But let me ask the young generation in this round, Mr. Kiermaier, Mr. Kieselov, thinking back into the 1960s, I wasn't even born then, but I'm told that students at the time worried about peace, global peace, worried about the environment already. Students did not just demonstrate on the streets and question the establishment. They also had hands-on solutions. Let me give you one example. They were worried about the volume of water that our societies consume. And what did they do? They put bricks into the water tanks of toilets in order to reduce the volume of water. These days we have these special buttons that we press in order to save water. I thought this is a nice example of students seeing a problem, being perhaps ahead of their time and finding a hands-on solution. what do students today, looking at the longer lives that they will have, compared to myself at least, what do you guys do to adapt your lifestyles to what is perceived as, the climate change challenge?
Well, if you stick to the water issue, maybe one thing would be that I haven't bought a bottled water in like 5 years.
Okay.
Because the water quality in Germany is so high that you can just drink it from the sink. And therefore you could reduce the air pollution from water being shipped or transported from everywhere, from the springs in France, for example, from Nestle to Germany to the supermarket. You could just reduce those emissions by just drinking the water from your sink, which is perfectly fine. And apart from that, something that's really huge nowadays, but I feel like wouldn't be as typical in the past, is this that the consumption of meat is a huge factor for our generation. Like everybody in my generation has thought about becoming a vegetarian or vegan or going vegan, even though most of them aren't. Like the vegetarian quote in Germany is like around about 2%. So it's not that huge, but still people are thinking about it, and people are maybe not every day consuming meat and not every day take the Sauerbraten in the cafeteria, in the Mensa.
Careful, we're in Bavaria, so...
Yeah, but even here, people
do like their meat here.
Of course, and I can remember when the Green Party was promoting this Fridays without meat in the public cafeterias. They were completely... They had eradicated any chance for winning the election. Right. But that's 5 years ago. Back then, the migration crisis was the dominant crisis, and what developed, what had an impact on the people. Today, it's the environmental crisis, and the Green Party is in an all-time high. And maybe if they would come up again with the same idea, that would be a boost for them, and then they would finally outvote the CSU in Bavaria. I don't know, but there are many ways the younger generation is adopting to new factors, and I feel like we can also learn from the past generation. But the past, all those small steps, and there is the Fridays for Future movement, which is putting out pressure on those that can make the huge steps. So I feel like that's something that's also very, I feel like...
as the first domino piece that
for example, and which is really inspiring to see that there are people who are passionate about the environment.
Yes. We'll come back to that environmental movement later on. Mr. Kiselov, what have you to kind of respond from a practical point of view? You're a young person, you're a lawyer, you're a budding lawyer, so you're engaging with all of these questions. But what would you say to us, older generation? Now, this is what I'm doing.
Yes, well, following from the priorities that were already established here, one of the main arguments against switching to a more environmentally friendly lifestyle has always been financial stability of a certain person. Oh, it is too difficult for me to afford to live a healthier and a more friendlier way for the environment, and that doesn't have to be the case. Following a bit from the obligations in tort liability already described a little bit by Professor Spia, is what are the obligations on each specific person when it comes to how much carbon footprint can you leave depending on your financial and personal situation. How many children is there in your family? How much money do you earn? But I think the beauty in to live in modern society is that you don't have to expend as much funds to live in a way that is environmentally friendly. Instead of a car, you use a bicycle. You don't have to worry about the cost associated with driving a motorized vehicle. Instead of, as mentioned previously, buying bottled water, you just drink it from the tap, because those opportunities have all been rendered more or less convenient. And I think that is the main argument when talking to students like me or people in my generation as well. Because the awareness of this basically impending catastrophe that we have to somehow circumnavigate is so clear now. We have to basically make this effort on our own side to alter our lifestyles accordingly as far as we can manage it ourselves. And I think that is incredibly portrayed also in the way that student groups like Fridays for Future in the University of Passau, or the significant exposure online of these, for example, the bushfires in Australia, people are aware that this is a problem and that this has to be handled. And you can say, this is a problem for the politicians, or I will somehow counteract this problem with my vote. This is where it starts, with your small actions that altogether will make a difference.
Grassroots level. What comes to mind is this phrase, agent of change. I have a 12-year-old son. He is in the 7th grade here in Passau, and he went to the Fridays for Future events here in Passau on a couple of occasions. So maybe my son, 12 years old, is already an agent of change. But in our discussions this morning, we were focusing on a different agent of change, courts and judges. So we're privileged in this round to have, of course, Chief Justice Preston here, a sitting judge in an area, land and environment, of course, very close to this issue of climate change. We have you, Jaap, as former Advocate General with tremendous experience in the practical application of law. And we have you, Ulrich, a former judge on the Court of Appeals in Hamburg. So my question to the three of you is, are we right in the sense that targeting courts with principles, with ideas, with projects, appealing to judges is the right way forward? I mean, there are other targets. There are legislators, for example, there's the industry, there's the market mechanism. Those are possible targets, but we're thinking of judges. What's your reaction?
First, it's an incomplete solution, of course. The judiciary can't do all that the executive and legislative branches of government can do. But they can be helpful as an agent for change. Not because they have a proactive agenda, they don't. Courts are responsive to the matters brought before them. But once the matter has been brought before them, they can make a decision, they can and give reasons for their decision, and that can make a difference, and that can drive change. So you see this co-production working between the different branches of government, between the judiciary, the legislature and the executive. Judiciary can make a decision. The legislature can respond with legislation if they want to. It may be to overcome the judiciary's decision. That's fine. They are sovereign. Or it could be they take on board the particular decision, and that's the impetus for new legislative change. The executive, they can respond with action, with policies. And so together you see this co-production for a beneficial result. And that's how democracy sort of works in a very cooperative manner. That's not to say, like in any partnership, there's not a little bit of tussles going on between them and a little bit of disagreement. But I think if you take a step back and look, you can see this change occurring through the decisions. And in the climate change space, the litigation can be a particular driver of change. It raises public awareness about it, and that's very important. We talked earlier about those fires in Australia raising awareness, but you can equally think of the cases in the Netherlands. The agenda case there has made ripples all around the world, and people are looking at it, and it's driving action. You've got action, and you can speak more about this in Germany, by the Peruvian farmer coming, and that's raising consciousness, and so that's changing demand, and people then respond in a particular way. So I think the courts do have a role. And one other point, just to put it, the thing about courts is that generally they are respected, and then when they speak with an authority that can make a difference. So it's not just that they are another voice, they are a voice that is respected in society and people listen to them, and that can make them a powerful agent for change.
I'm intrigued to hear what you have to say, Jaap, for the Netherlands, and you, Ulrich, for Germany. But before I do that, just a kind of a comment. We've seen some systems like the United States of America, or more particular, the United Kingdom, where judges have been exposed to severe criticism for injecting themselves into certain questions, like Brexit, for example. And yet, of course, they can't avoid the question. The case is there, and they have to decide. So I think this criticism is beside the point. What I would like to kind of emphasize is that judges have that additional authority, as you rightly describe. At the same time, they have to tread carefully, because they are usually not elected, and they might run into the risk of counter-majoritarian arguments. You're kind of ruling society from the bench. But what say you, Jaap? What's your impression? Are judges the right target for academic projects like ours?
Well, many judges probably are, certainly not all. Some are hopeless. Many of them live in the US. But, and there are more examples of hopeless judges. But if you talk to them, if you listen to what they write and their presentations at international events, it's crystal clear that many of them understand that they must attune with the changing demands of society. Some people believe, well, that's judicial activism. You can debate at length whether that's right or not. But I very strongly believe that within the boundaries of the law, and of course they have to accept that there are limits to what they can do, that within the boundaries of the law, they must play a role if all other players refrain from taking their responsibilities, which unfortunately is the case these days. There's not much more than pep talk and prattle about, well, there's a problem, we have to take action, we have to solve it together. Well, that's all true, but it doesn't bring us any further. And as long as that's the case, well, we can only hope that judges will assume responsibility for a problem others are unwilling to solve.
Judges, Ulrich, are in a difficult position, and maybe in a privileged position at the same time. If I'm a legislator and I see elections coming up, I might choose to defer or circumvent an issue because it's not something I really want to discuss in the open at this point in time. I pick and choose the topics that I feel more comfortable with. Judges are not in that privileged position. There's a case. There are parties. They're looking at you and they want a decision. Yeah. So what would your response be? Judges as an agent of change simply because they are cornered by the parties, they're cornered by a case, and there's nowhere for them to go.
Quite right. The courts need the right claimants, actually. Persons that are bringing cases, difficult cases and climate change cases before them. Otherwise, the courts can't decide. And if they have the right case, they have the final say in the end on that case. These are the great advantages, but overall and beyond that, we have the separation of powers. Judges should not be legislators, but if the legislator fails to legislate, then again only the court is the only institution that can help to remedy the mischief that you find in society. And in that sense, I feel judges must act like a legislator would act. By the way, in the Swiss court, you find that gaps in the law should be filled by the judge acting like a legislator. That is written there as a provision. And that is I feel the very honoring and serious task of the judge. It's sad that judges are regularly rather conservative, but you see that always in all societies we have judges that have put the law further and have invented new tools and invented new techniques to bring the law in a position to solve these problems. And that I would expect from judges like you.
Looking at the United States of America, you criticized some American judges just a couple of minutes ago. Many of you.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I will say American judges are willing to say that we're making the law rather than discovering the law in other jurisdictions. So they're quite aggressive at times, and they have come up with interesting, helpful solutions, innovative solutions in the United States of America.
Fields.
In a number of areas. Bernard, we talked earlier of lessons learned in other areas. Can you point us to one or two examples where, in different contexts, whether it's pharmaceuticals or the BP oil spill or the Contergan issue, where we've learned lessons in the area of torts that we can now utilize for carbon emissions and climate change?
Well, to some extent, it depends on the legal system and the court system and the role of the courts. So some legal systems do not allow or do not facilitate mass claims. And so those jurisdictions will typically not generate sort of the leading cases that we could build upon. But you yourself just mentioned US cases. And I'm just thinking of one of the classic cases of market share liability, the DES cases, where you have a drug that was sold to women, pregnant women, and many years later it turned out that female offsprings developed a certain disease or a certain range of diseases, and they then sued the producers of this drug, many of which had disappeared from the market, and the judge there actually struck a sword into this Gordian knot and disentangled the multiple claims and found a very creative solution, which was then, I think, also taken over in the Netherlands in the DS daughters cases. But there are some scenarios where tort law in the courts does not provide all the answers, of course. And there are some tort cases where the legal system had to step in otherwise. Very often, the larger the challenges, the more likely we'll have an ad hoc solution. So, for example, the BP oil spill case that you mentioned, it would have been probably too big to handle in a court as such. Particularly in light of the limited tools that judges had available at the time. So in that case, you would have a rather better path in an ad hoc solution, in this case establishing a fund with a fund administrator who is capable and used to handling these large claim losses and bring them together. So it really depends on the legal system, I would say, whether they offer the tools to administer these claims properly and adequately. But at the end of the day, the underlying idea is always the same. It's trying to find a proper solution for the risks and to distribute the risks properly and to find the proper tools to deal with that.
But there's something in the toolbox, so to say,
yes,
that we can draw on. We discussed earlier the problem of balancing interests. If we're worried about climate change, global warming, one simple solution could be, let's shut all these operations down. But on the other hand, we might have massive unemployment, and suddenly people feel, my God, my pension fund has just gone out of the window. And suddenly people have to make choices between an abstract problem that might occur generations later and their very immediate interest here and now in earning a salary or securing a pension. Mr. Kiermaier, Fridays for Future, of course, is on the climate change side of the equation. I know you're not speaking for that organization, but as someone who's interested in these activities, someone who's engaging with movements of this kind, what balance of interests, what solutions for these critical kind of tensions would you see? What would you tell a pensioner who's losing his pension because the pension fund is now kind of, involved in this liability issue, or someone who's now unemployed because the factory that he, used to walk to every morning to earn his money has been closed down because of the emissions? What's the answer of these, movements to these tensions?
Well, if I had the perfect answer, I wouldn't be here, because I wouldn't be a head of Fridays for Future or even some nation, because that's basically the most crucial question you can ask me, because it's pretty much impossible to answer it and to find a way. We also already mentioned it before, and there is no way that everybody can be happy. I already experienced that the tensions between the two opposing sides, between those who are going to the street, out on the streets for protesting against the climate change for Fridays for Future, and those who aren't fans, let's say it nicely, are already very tough. We already get booed, we already get other things said too, so the tension is very high, and still Fridays for Future and I myself feel like that the future belongs to the younger generation, so there always has to be development and taking actions that are for the benefit of the younger. That's my point of view, and apart from that, I feel like that it's not the question of Fridays for Future. It's the politicians, it's maybe also the lawyers that have to come up with regulations, with ideas for those that seem to be left behind. But if you look at it right now, the majority in Germany or in the Western states are have a really good system that's backing them up if they are if they get unemployed, if their jobs get cut down. So it's a difficult question to answer, and I don't have the perfect answer to this, unfortunately.
It'll be part of our project for sure to balance these interests. I think it's very... yes, please.
Point which I think brings together some of the things we're talking about, and it reminded me in negotiation or mediation sort of theory, and they talk about, for example, distributive solutions, where you have a pie, or maybe an apple strudel here, where you divide it up. So if we were here and we were trying to work out, we might sort of come up with, let's divide that pie into a certain number so that everyone gets something. And that can also leave some people dissatisfied. And then you come up with more creative solutions where you increase the size of the pie. And so therefore you've got more ability to be able to distribute. And I think one of the things the problems we're in at the moment is we are very much in a distributive solutions. So it comes down to sometimes either or. It's either going to be the climate gets wrecked by continuing with fossil fuel industries, or we save the jobs. And which one is it? You make a choice. Well, can we not find more creative solutions? So it may be, for example, that we say, yes, let's phase out certain fossil fuel industry. Let's phase out coal-fired power stations and our reliance upon it. But let's come up with putting new solutions in which will do it. There could be a financial package to retrain the employees so that they don't just lose their jobs, they are actually retrained and able to go into new industries. We come up with bringing up other industries, so we promote those so that we get new jobs being created in another area. And if we think about over time, you know, how many people are working as blacksmiths? How many people are working in steam engines, right? But they will, of course, employed millions of people, you know, over time. But those industries have gone, new industries have come. You talked about Microsoft. You know, when we went to university, there wasn't those sort of big companies and doing things. They are new industries. So there are new opportunities that can come. So what we need to be is creative and putting new solutions on the table. And so that this binary choices that we see being posed now are not the only ones.
I can see, yes, please.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Brian, but we also have to accept, I'm afraid, that there are limits to economic growth. So we also perhaps have to accept that not all people who lose their jobs will get alternative jobs. That's very sad and very unfortunate. I'm afraid it's the only way to solve the problem.
I was about to stop our discussion on this very upbeat and positive note, emphasizing things like enlarging the apple strudel, innovative solutions, new legal ideas and approaches that will help us find the key to solving climate change. You intervene just in time, and I think you're right. Let's not kid ourselves. It's going to be difficult. In any case, gentlemen, thank you very, very much for joining me in this discussion here at the University of Passau. I do hope that our project will move forward quickly and that we can make a modest, at least, contribution via judges or other agents of change, young students engaging in these issues. So thank you very much again for your participation. And I hope to see some of you in Passau again very soon for another chapter in this project. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.